Hello everybody. In this video we're going to be comparing GDP across countries. So we're going to be looking at total GDP and GDP per capita and see how these compare across countries. So what we've got here is a map of the world in 2018. The darker the country, the higher its total GDP and vice versa. And so what we can see here is that what really sticks out dramatically are the United States and China. In 2018, the United States was the largest GDP in the world at 20.5 trillion US dollars. And China, so it was United States was number 1, China was number 2 at 13.6 trillion US dollars for number 2. It is an important item to note. These are measured both in US dollars, not the Chinese local currency. If you had data that was in the Chinese currency, you would need to convert it with an exchange rate. But for the basic analysis, what we're doing, and generally speaking, for most data sets, that conversion was already made for you. So here we're looking at an apples-to-apples basis. $20 trillion U.S. economy, $13.6 trillion Chinese economy. And then we have some other countries here that also have pretty large GDPs, just based on the coloring here. So certainly, places like Germany and England and generally Western Europe have pretty high GDPs. But also take here, you've got India, Australia, Brazil, Mexico, Canada, Russia. A lot of these other countries also have very high total GDPs. Why is that the case? Especially for countries that you don't typically think of as super wealthy nations, perhaps countries like India or Brazil, perhaps. The reason is they have large populations, and if you have a lot of people, then you need a lot of production. You have a lot of labor, and so just by the nature of having a very large population, you're going to have large GDP. And in fact, that is why China has the number 2 largest economy. They also happen to have the largest population in the world. So largest GDPs, kind of our takeaway from this. Largest GDPs are countries with large populations. Both developed and developing countries. What we typically think of as developed and developing countries. So how do we actually know then if the people living in the countries are living kind of a nice life and having their own form of economic success? In order to see that by country, we have to divide by the population to get this idea of GDP per capita. So, U.S. economy has the largest GDP in the world, but it's also the 3rd most populous. China, 2nd largest GDP, most populous. So, if we want to think about really the standard of living in a country, we use real GDP per capita. And GDP per capita is just defined as GDP divided by the population. And if we take that and look at another map of the world, things are going to change quite a bit. So, United States is still dark colored. The American GDP per capita back in 2018 was about $63,000. Really, GDP, because we can think of it as total income in the economy, GDP divided by the population is kind of like the average income in a way. So United States GDP, GDP per capita 63,000. It's not number one anymore. It's not number 2 or 3 even. It's falling more into the 15 to 20, ranked 15th to 20th in the world range at this point. But again, so now China's gone. Chinese real GDP per capita in 2018 was about $10,000. And so all of a sudden, if you control for the population by dividing GDP by that population, the Chinese economy is much less developed on a per person basis. And that's really when we do start to see these, what we typically think of as developed nations, Western Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan over here in South Korea. Although here we also have some Saudi Arabia, Qatar. Qatar is actually one of the top 3 highest real GDPs per capita. And that's because they are very oil rich. So they do have a relatively high GDP, but also with a small population. If you're dividing by a small population, a small denominator means you're going to have a larger number as the outcome. So there are in the top, say, 25 countries, a number of very, very small countries, which you don't typically think of as wealthy nations, but that's because they have some form of wealth and a very small population. But generally speaking, for GDP per capita, largest GDP per capita nations are typically what we think of as typically thought of as the developed economies. So United States, Western Europe, Canada, so on and so forth. But also, and rich, most of these rich countries are getting their wealth from oil, rich and small nations. Okay, and so there you have it. Comparing GDP across geographies, it's important to take into account GDP on a per capita basis, and in doing so, we're going to get a much better idea of the standard of living in that country. Which brings us to the last part of this chapter, GDP and well-being, and generally the standard of living, which we define as all elements that affect people's happiness and well-being, whether they are bought and sold on the market or not. All elements that affect people's well-being, whether they are bought and sold on the market or not. Okay, and if you think about this, there are things in our lives apart from money that make us happy and that provide a high quality of life. And so think about some of these, what they are, and really because GDP is just measuring the monetary value of all production. Also, we could measure it as total income, total expenditure on everything. There are a lot of things that it does not include, and I'd like you to maybe pause the video for a second and think about what some of these could be. And come back, and I'm going to start writing these down. So a number of possibilities here. We can think of a few. One is just simply leisure time. So as we've developed economically as a nation, we spend less time working and more time with leisure, more time going on vacations, people retiring slightly earlier. That's not captured in GDP, but it is something that contributes to a high standard of living, quality of life. Other things are the environment, environmental considerations, health, being in good health is really nice, and education, being able to get educated adds to this idea of the standard of living. We have production not exchanged in the market. Production not exchanged in the market. This we can think of as, well, one example would be something like stay-at-home parents. If a family decides that that is important to them and that's going to increase their quality of life, their standard of living, by not working, that'll actually decrease GDP, but their standard of living may be higher, right? And so based on their values. So that's not incorporated into GDP either. In fact, it goes the opposite way. Things like inequality, to the extent that that affects standard of living, and then cultural and family ties. Generally, being part of a community also increases standard of living. So GDP doesn't capture all of these things, and actually there are countries in the world who try to more directly measure this. One example is Bhutan. They have something called Gross National Happiness Index. That link there just goes to YouTube. There are a number of interesting videos. If you just type in Gross National Happiness Bhutan, a number of interesting videos you can watch there, and TED Talks as well. So other countries try to measure some of these things a little bit more directly, but one, it's a lot harder to do. It's maybe a little easier to do in much smaller countries, but with a big country, it's not going to be quite as feasible to have such large-scale surveys on such a timely basis that we're able to collect GDP data. And although real GDP per capita doesn't measure all of these things, they are still very highly correlated. So richer countries, as measured by real GDP per capita, richer countries have better educational outcomes, better health outcomes, better literacy rates, higher life expectancies, more leisure, so on and so forth. So real GDP doesn't capture everything that's important in life, but it is highly correlated with it. And so using real GDP per capita is still a reasonable metric to use to think about economic growth and the growth of a country's standard of living. Okay, and that's going to do it for this chapter. And in the next series of videos, we're going to be looking at some applications of GDP, looking at some actual data, going out and seeing how has the United States economy changed over time, and what types of industries compose the economy. We're going to look at some specific things in manufacturing, and so on and so forth. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, stay tuned for the next video, and I'll see you there. Thanks.